All right, so I can take over the waiting room from this point.
Great, thank you.
All right, so, just as I start, someone else is in the waiting room. Hang on.
I got it.
You got it. Thanks, Janice.
Come on over.
All right, we are at 7:01, so I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. We really appreciate everyone joining us tonight. My name is Ann Morin. I will be moderating the session tonight. Janice, can you just go ahead and keep track of that waiting room for me? Thank you very much. My name is Ann. I'm a member of Hingham Net Zero's Community Engagement Working Group. And one of the things we do in that group is try to reach out to the public and help with education and awareness building. And tonight's forum is all about managing food waste and composting. So before we get into the good details, I'm going to review a little bit of the Zoom protocol. We are recording this forum, so if you're shy, you can keep your camera off. But if not, we'd love to see you. I would ask that everybody please mute themselves. I think we're actually able to mute you, and that's just to avoid any type of distraction. As for questions, we are going to save all our questions till the end, but if you want, you can go ahead and type them in the chat, and I will try to get to them when it's convenient, but probably at the end, pardon me, at the end of the conversation. So I'm just letting a couple more people join us here. Again, we're recording the session. I think I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenters. We have three rock stars with us tonight. We've got Brenda Black, who is a Hingham Net Zero member, a home composter. She's had a long time interest in sustainability issues ever since the very first Earth Day in 1970. So I love that fact about you, Brenda. She was a member of the Cleaner, Greener Hingham Committee for 13 years, where she worked with some of the school green committees and helped with green initiatives around town. We also have Janice McPhillips, also known as the Compost Queen, a title that I hope she wears affectionately. She's been composting at home for more than 30 years. She's an avid home gardener. She's a coordinator of the Weir River Farm Community Garden for the past 2 seasons. And if you have kids at our local schools, you've probably seen her helping out with the organic gardens and the composting efforts at the school in Hingham. And like Brenda, she was also a longtime member of the Cleaner, Greener Hingham Town Committee. And last but not least, we have Peter Swanson. Peter is a former biology and environmental science teacher. And Peter is a strong believer that we need to teach the children, to get the children engaged in these types of efforts. He has worked with poor communities in the Honduras, trying to teach them sustainable practices that will improve their lives and improve their nutrition. So just want to say hi to those of you who just joined us. Again, this is the Hingham Net Zero Forum on managing food waste and composting with Brenda Black, Janice McPhillips, and Peter Swanson. So please hold your questions to the end. If you just have something top of mind that you can't wait to share with us, just go ahead and put it in the chat and I will keep note of it. Again, this session's being recorded and will be shared on our website later on. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Brenda, who I believe is starting us off tonight.
All right, thank you. Let me get the process of getting the screen sharing going here. Okay, so we want to sort of direct this conversation to the idea of lowering your carbon footprint by reducing food waste and by composting as much of the rest as you can. So that's what we are up to this evening. I come to this not as somebody who has formally studied the issue of food waste, except for my years on the town waste planning committee and recycling committee, but more having decided to be part of this presentation, I've simply done a lot of reading in the last many weeks. So kind of want to share with you some of the things that I've learned, some of which were surprising, some of which were kind of things that you sort of knew, but I hadn't quite committed to using myself. So I'll try to include some of my experiences of applying these ideas. So the idea behind paying attention to food waste is that unfortunately, the amount of food that gets wasted in our world right now makes food waste literally the third largest emitter of carbon after China and the US. So if we were a country, food waste everywhere would be creating that much carbon, which is a problem, as you know, in terms of climate change at this point. Here in the US, all of the studies say that between 30 and 40% of the food that we grow never ends up being consumed. Which is a shame in lots of ways, but specifically in terms of how much water and energy and carbon is used and is emitted in the process of growing that food and transporting that food, to have it then become waste, which then also creates more carbon, is obviously something we want to be trying to make changes in if we're trying to address climate change these days. For those parts of the country that waste goes into a landfill, food waste literally becomes methane, or emits methane as it decomposes, and that's 8 times more powerful than carbon CO2 is. Here in Hingham, our waste actually goes to the incinerator down at CMAS. I think Janice will actually give you some information about what the current numbers are coming into CMAS, the amount of food waste that's going there these days. But the part that I want to call your attention to that I was surprised by, all of the information that you sort of see in the media is more about sort of wastage that happens in the fields, maybe food never getting on its way to market, or food that gets wasted or becomes spoiled in the process of transportation. Turns out, though, that only 20% of the food waste that happens in this country is from either staying on the farm or getting spoiled in transit. About 1% gets wasted at food processing plants where they find food that can't be used in their processing procedures. 35% gets thrown away in grocery stores and restaurants, which is a big amount. And then the biggest amount actually comes from our own homes. And that's the part that I was a bit surprised by. So literally Americans right now are wasting big amounts of food, and that's something that I think each of us can do something about. So I'm hoping to offer you some ideas about how you might begin to pay attention to this issue in your household and come up with some ways that might help you reduce your food waste. You know, the big message is, if we actively reduce food waste by buying only what we actually are going to use in a timely way, buying food, sometimes it's imperfect because it suits our needs and therefore keeps it out of the waste stream, and working to avoid wasting food before and after you cook it, we can probably make some progress on this. So all of the studies say that the first thing to do, of course, if you're trying to change a habit behavior, which is what I think most Americans have with regards to food and how it becomes wasted, is to pay attention to where is doing an audit of how you're actually doing things in your house. And for different families, it's going to be a different problem. Are you buying and then forgetting to use the foods? Or are you buying without a plan of how you actually will use it, and then it sits in a cabinet and reaches a point where you no longer feel like you want to be ever eating it? Are you cooking or serving more than your family can actually eat? Do you end up with lots of leftovers in the pan, or do you end up with lots of leftovers coming back into the kitchen on the plates? You know, where in your household is food waste happening? Specifically, what's going to waste? Is it your fresh fruits? Is it your fresh vegetables? Is it your salad greens, your meats, your breads, your canned foods, or the other kinds of processed foods that you have? Are things going bad in your freezer? So I think the only way to find that out is to actually ask the question. And the audit process is the process of just keeping track for a couple of weeks. What is going into your trash as food waste, that you might be able to come up with a way to change that habit so it doesn't end up there eventually. The other thing to keep in mind is that the carbon footprint of all foods is not at all equal. Meats, especially beef, produce the process of getting a kilo of beef to your house has 60 kilogram equivalents of carbon, as compared to chicken at 10 and vegetables and things more at 3. So it's a huge factor when meats, specifically beef, go to waste. So paying attention, if you want to start somewhere, start with working very hard to reduce any meat that might be getting wasted in your household, and any dairy, especially cheese. Okay, so strategies. I'm basically going to tell you the ones that I've read about in all these different studies. Some of them I think are kind of intriguing and fun. Some are probably pretty straightforward and obvious, but if you're working to reduce your food waste, these are the things to keep in mind. First thing is really planning meals, thinking through specifically how many nights are people in your family going to be home for dinner, how many people will be home for dinner, how much of a particular ingredient actually goes into the meal that you're planning. And to start by shopping in your own refrigerator and in your own cabinets before you go to the store. If you want to be using up food before it goes bad, pay attention to what you have and use that first. Making a list when you go to the store so that it actually has the amount that you need for the recipes or meals that you have planned. That sort of helps break into the habit of, oh, something's on sale, let me grab it, without having made a plan to actually use it. If you are somebody that likes to pay attention to sales or use coupons, just invite you to look at them look at the flyers and or online to see what's available this week at the store you're planning to go to, and incorporate those sale items into your plan for the week. The other thing to pay attention to is to shop in stores that allow you to purchase exactly what you need. If the recipe you're making for a stew has a requirement for 3 carrots, buy 3 carrots instead of a pound, if you don't have another way that you know you'll be using the rest of a pound bag. So many stores these days do allow you to simply pick 1 or 2 carrots. The Fruit Center is certainly one of them. The Shaw's Markets are those. I was in Big Y this week and saw that they also have that kind of display where you can pick exactly the number of potatoes or the exact number of zucchini you need, or as I say, carrots or celery for starting your stew. And as you probably are aware, Fruit Center sells small packages of fresh herbs in the amounts that are more likely to match what your recipe calls for and are considerably cheaper than the prepackaged larger plastic collections of herbs in the other grocery stores. So if you're somebody that likes to use fresh herbs and aren't growing them yourself, that's a way of doing it and producing less waste. And there's always a caution in these articles about careful for the 2-for-1 sales, because saving money doesn't really work if you're not actually finding a way to really use that second one that you're bringing home. And overall, and whenever we're trying to change a habit, pay attention to what's working. And if something's not working, as in you're seeing yourself throwing things in the trash, that means it's time to make a plan differently next time so that you can end up with a different outcome next time. Okay, so specific ways of tackling some of those things. As I say, think about, do I really need a pound of carrots or do I need 3? The meat that I just bought, the recipe I'm planning to make this week calls for this amount. This is a larger amount. So literally when you come home from the store, think about, is that the best time to cut the portion that you're going to use, put that in the fridge, put the other portion in the freezer for a future time so that it doesn't in fact begin to spoil before in your own fridge. The notion of buying ugly or imperfect vegetables comes from the fact that many of these papers talk about how there's sort of an abundance factor for shoppers, and stores know this, that if there are a few of a certain produce item like apples in a display, people tend not to buy them. But if there's a huge overflowing abundant display, that seems to draw customers in, causes them to then purchase things. And stores know that. So they put out way too much, and they know they're putting out too much to help entice you to buy things. But then that also means that they end up with a lot of vegetables and fruits that literally go bad as they sit in the store, become unattractive to buy. And they do plan to throw them out. I'm sure you've seen in grocery stores, the produce workers culling out things that are beginning to look bad. And those do simply get thrown out at that point. So if you know, as I did for Thanksgiving last week, that you're going to be making an apple pie that day, then you can be the one to buy the apple that looks like it's beginning to get a little dried up, or one that has a dent in it somehow. You know you're going to be using it. You know that you can cut out any part that doesn't look great, and you know that by you buying it and taking it home, you end up keeping it from going into trash. Many grocery stores these days do also have racks of produce that's beginning to fade, and they sell it for cheaper. And that's also a way of saving money if that is important to you. Many of the articles talk about thinking about meats and fish, or, especially in other parts of the country where you don't have access to fresh fish as we do here. Most fish is actually frozen, so by the time it is then sold as fresh fish in the market, it really can only last a few days. Whereas if you buy frozen fish, you can keep it in your own freezer until the actual day you plan to use it. So it will be, in fact, super fresh at that point and ready to use. So think about whether for you and your family, will it work better to have packages of hamburger that are frozen rather than buying it and not being sure exactly what day you're going to use it and maybe allowing it to go bad. Okay. So another area to pay attention to is how you store foods. Storing things correctly to avoid wastage can make a big difference for many families. One suggestion is to, if you're bringing home carrots and celery for your kids to snack on, or fruit for your kids to snack on, prep them when you get home, put them in the fridge so that they are literally ready to grab. They'll be more likely to actually get eaten than if you have the good intention of serving carrots to your kids, but putting the pound bag in your veggie drawer and forgetting that it's there until they start to grow interesting little root structures. And same thing for fruit, that if you want fruit out for your kids to grab, leave enough for a day or so on your counter, keep the rest in the fridge because they'll last much longer, and simply replenish the counter as it gets used up. A lot of suggestions in these articles about place the foods that fade fast right in the front of the fridge shelves so that you'll see them every time you open your fridge door, making it more likely for you to actually grab them to use them. And certainly placing things like dairy and meats in the coolest parts of your fridge. And every USDA article warns against putting milk, eggs, cheese in the doors of your refrigerator, because those are the parts of your fridge that get warmest fastest. As I said before, dividing meats into the portions you're actually going to use and freezing any excess from the beginning means that it'll be very in good shape to use the next time you're ready to use it. And they also talk a lot about paying attention to how things are playing out in your refrigerator. If your meals plans change because the family's plans change, think about whether it's time to cut up those vegetables, those fruits, any leftovers, and put them into the freezer now so that you can pull them out later for things like soups or frittatas or smoothies, and they will be in good shape to use at that point. So. Okay. Cooking the right amount. This is where you kind of have to be honest with yourself. Are you a family that really does use leftovers? Because if you're going to eat them, then it's great to cook enough in advance that you've got it in the fridge to use for a later meal. But if you've got a family that won't use leftovers, then start to figure out how much less you need to make each meal so that you don't end up with leftovers that won't get used. One of the things that I didn't know was that I'd always been taught back in the 70s in the energy consciousness period there, that the reason you don't put hot foods from cooking into the refrigerator is because it warms up everything else in the fridge and lowers the temperature and therefore the saving power for all the other foods. But it turns out that the condensation that happens with hot foods inside of a closed container in the fridge, that condensation produces an environment where actually decomposition happens faster. So if you let your foods cool on the counter for an hour and then put them in the fridge, they'll last longer for you. Okay. So if, other than the idea of planning your meals before you go to the grocery store, this is probably the most important one. The labels that you see on all of our foods these days, the best by, the use by, the sell by dates, these terms are in no way regulated. They do not mean anything consistent, and they never refer to food safety. So they are not about food safety. The only exception is infant formula, which you probably can understand. Feeding a 8-pound infant, they need a certain amount of nutrition out of every ounce of formula. So if a formula has been allowed to be sort of kept on the shelf too long, it loses some of its nutrition, and that's dangerous for an infant. So there are expiration dates on infant formula, but that is the only regulated one anywhere in the US food market. So the way to understand those dates is that each producer has chosen how they will label their food. Most often it's in order to communicate stores ways that they can manage their inventory. You know, something's been out for this long, you move you try to move that to be sold sooner rather than something that's come in later. But basically all of those terms, best by, use by, sell by, They are the manufacturer or producer's estimate of when the flavor will be best. It has nothing to do with whether it still is nutritious, and definitely nothing to do with whether it's safe. So most foods are nutritious and safe way beyond those sell by, use by, sell by dates. If you want to know more about how to actually think in terms of how likely your foods are to still be nutritious, and go to this website, Eat by Date, which really will give you some pretty solid information for different types of foods and the storing conditions, and how long you should expect that they will still have a great deal of nutrition in them. And unfortunately, the only way, but still the reliable way to know whether food is safe, is using your eyes and your nose. Something that's growing mold, something, except for blue cheese, something that is in a bulging can, which means decomposition is happening with gas being produced, open packages, off smells. Those are still really the only way to know whether food is safe. So a lot of food gets thrown out in this country because people think sell by or use by means, uh-oh, it'll be dangerous if I eat it after that. And that's simply not true. So the picture that I found for this milk display in this grocery store, the problem obviously with that is that all of that milk is now being, all of those gallons that they want to sell quickly, they've put on top in the front, and those are now no longer being refrigerated. And milk does go bad after. I mean, milk can be stored at room temperature, as it always was on the farm, for 24 hours without spoiling. But after that, it does deteriorate very quickly. And when milk is sitting on top of the display rather than in the refrigerated display, it's obviously being exposed to a much higher temperature than what will keep it safe for a long time. All right, I wanted to mention quickly sort of the ugly food movement that's kind of been going around, building up in the last 10 years or so. I think these companies, Misfit Market, Imperfect Foods, Full Harvest, Hungry Harvest, all of them sort of come from the notion of let's try to use our food well. They say that what they're doing is rescuing foods to keep them from being wasted, and their advertising tends to show fields where crops are being left behind. That's actually not particularly accurate. What they really sell to you are the second grade foods that are already being harvested and brought into the food chain. They just normally go to processors for being made into prepared foods, or go to institutional kitchens where, again, they are chopped, cooked, and used to prepare meals where the sort of no particular single customer is picking the raw food. So you're not really rescuing food that otherwise would go to waste. You are, however, reducing packaging. Your Misfit collection will come in a single box rather than everything packaged. So that certainly cuts down on packaging. And certainly some farmers are getting paid more for their second grade produce than they would normally. But it's not really a solution to the food waste problem. You'd also should pay attention to that. Some of these programs allow you to pick what you will get in your box when it's delivered to your house. Others, you get it sort of like a CSA share, where you will get a collection of things that they have. You then need to make sure, if you're going to have this be about wastage, use all the things that come to you. And sometimes that's hard if you're a family that's not very flexible on what you'll eat. So just be aware of that. I would say to you that it's more helpful if you're really interested in reducing grocery store waste. And again, grocery stores and restaurants are 35% of our current waste problem. Would be to be the person who does pick the blemished or fading produce if it will work for you. If you know you're going home to make a stew or a soup that day, then you certainly can use that carrot that's beginning to look a little limp, whereas somebody else who wants it for something 4 or 5 days from now might not want to do that. And I'm hopeful. France put a program into place a few years ago that grocery stores are not allowed to throw out food, period. So they must find a way to donate it to be used in some other way, whether it be for animal feed or donated to a charity or that kind of thing. So if our country made that decision, we would go a long way towards reducing our food waste as well. Now, these are the programs that really are about rescuing food. Gleaning is apparently a biblical term referring to going to fields after the harvest to harvest any leftover produce that's there. And there is an organization called the Boston Area Gleaners here in this area. They're based out of the Waltham Agricultural Station that's part of UMass's agricultural program. They do organize gleaning trips to farms and orchards within 40 miles of Boston. If you want to volunteer, you get on the list, you get information about each of these trips, and you decide which ones you can participate in. You arrive, they're working well under the COVID conditions right now. Harvest foods that are left because they weren't perfectly ripe on the day that the farmer's harvesting crew went through, or foods that don't look 100% perfect but still will taste fine. So those get harvested and then taken to local food banks and nonprofits. Just as an interesting note, our own Hingham Farmers Market, part of the Friends of the Hingham Farmers Market, there's someone who picks up produce from the vendors if they have things that they want to donate, and takes them to Father Bill's in Quincy, the homeless shelter there, every Saturday after the market closes. So Hingham does a little bit of its own gleaning that way. And then there are several organizations in our area that do pick up raw and already cooked foods from grocery stores, from restaurants, from big institutional cafeterias in the greater sort of Boston area, and then they bring them to food programs in Cambridge and Somerville. And Loving Spoonfuls does this all around the state in 40 different cities and towns in the state. So those are organizations that sometimes can use volunteer help. They all can definitely use financial donations. So if you want to be part of the solution that way, that's how you could do that. And last but not least, the Greater Boston Food Bank, they collect industry donated foods, and then they take the financial donations they get and buy foods at the sort of manufacturing level so that they can then provide them to food pantries around the area. As you probably know, if you donate to the Hingham Food Pantry, if you give $1 to the food pantry, they're able to buy $3 worth of food through the Greater Boston Food Bank. So it's a very powerful way of helping address the hunger issue anyway. And last but not least, I just want to offer you information, some of the websites that I think can really be helpful in your process of trying to figure out how you might be able to reduce food waste from your home. The audit process I talked about is something published under the Food Too Good to Waste Toolkit. Smart shopping literally sets up your shopping list according to the meals you're planning to cook and the amounts that your recipes or plan call for, so that you have that with you in the grocery store. And here is the link to the Eat by Date website. And then another way of approaching this is if you look in your house and you see you've got a certain ingredients, these three websites, Big Oven, Supercook, and My Fridge Food, they will actually, you click off the ingredients that you have, and they will then show you recipes that will take advantage of those foods that you have in your house already. And if you have a main ingredient that you're trying to figure out a way to use, Epicurious and All Recipes can offer you something equivalent. So hopefully those are ideas of how to tackle food waste as it may be occurring in your house. I'm certainly working on it on my end, and invite all of you to as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Brenda. Before we hand it over to Janice, someone did have a question, and I know you mentioned some of these organizations that glean food from stores and restaurants. Do you know whether any of the local grocery stores, fruit centers, Stop and Shop, what do they do with their food waste? Someone was asking if we could maybe one day send it to the transfer station and get it composted.
Oh, that's a very, we are very, in my many years on the recycling committee, and Janice, who's continuing to be on that, that is an ongoing project. We would love to see the transfer station collect food waste. They continue to feel like they don't have space to do that collection. You may have noticed that there are at least 2, if not 3, Janice may know, companies that are now picking up food waste from Hingham residents. And if you drive around town, you may see small green toters that are out in front, and those are for food waste. So if you want to compost, have your food waste go that way, it is possible to do, but you need to do it by a subscription service at this point.
Right. And do you know,
was told that,
whether the stores...
Say what?
Yeah, I can answer that question actually.
Okay.
So yes, the fruit center does compost their food waste, and actually very begrudgingly, I do have a slide in my presentation about pickup service, and one of the companies that does offer pickup service, Black Earth Compost, does have a contract to pick up food waste from the fruit center. And then Stop and Shop all of the food waste from all of the Stop Shops in this part of the state is taken back to a anaerobic digester, which is in Freetown. And actually Peter, who's going to speak after me, has been to visit that, so he can talk about that. But an anaerobic digester is what the MWRA wastewater treatment center by the airport is. The big, the eggs, the things, the big, huge 80 or 180 foot tall, I think they are, eggs, where all wastewater and sewage from Boston is processed in a big anaerobic digester plant. So actually that's what Stop and Shop does with their food waste.
Okay, thank you.
So Brenda, you need to unshare your screen.
We'll do so.
And thank you, I learned a few things. Great. Now I've got to share my screen. Let's see if I can do that. Gosh, I don't see my,
Janice, there should be a green icon at the bottom of your screen that says share.
yeah, but I'm trying to get my,
Just trying to find her thing.
oh gosh.
Oh, I see. Got it.
I knew this was gonna
If
happen.
you exit full screen.
Share screen. There we go. I found it. All right. Can you see that?
Yep. And if you can expand it.
Yeah, so let's see. Slideshow, play from the start. Okay. Alrighty. So as Brenda said, you know, the goal is to shop better and waste less, eat more, waste less, because food is very hard to grow. I work at a farm, as I think Ann said in the introduction, and I'm a home gardener, and I wouldn't say I grow most of our family's food, but growing food is very resource intensive in terms of time, labor, water, energy, and one of the things I like to impart onto children when I'm teaching is that it's very hard work to grow it. So please appreciate it, don't waste it. But if you do have leftovers and it's fruit and vegetable waste, especially, then you can compost it. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about backyard composting. So for you English majors in the audience, I always think it's fun to point out that compost is both a noun and a verb. The noun is the stuff and the verb is the process of making compost. So I like lists, and so I have a list of 10 reasons why making compost and using it is a great idea. Think of composting as a very local form of recycling. You're just taking the nutrients in plants and turning it into something that you can use. And I'll give you a sales pitch from the get-go. You don't have to be a vegetable gardener to make and use compost. In fact, I just wrote an article that was published in the Anchor a couple days ago that you can go find in the Green Living section of the Anchor about things you can do with compost. So if you are an apartment dweller and you don't have a vegetable garden or a flower garden or even a yard, you can always put compost into a flower pot on your deck or your patio. And like I said, it's a form of recycling. For reasons that I will get into later, I have some data from the state on garbage, how much garbage we throw away. Composting saves a lot of money on disposal cost. Our point number 3 doesn't really apply to us because our trash in this part of the state goes to a waste to energy facility called Covanta CMAS, which is in Rochester, I think, right, Brenda?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Which is about 50 some miles away from here. So, but in other parts of the state and in other parts of the country, trash is landfilled. And so anything that goes into a landfill can't decompose. So don't fool yourself into thinking that if you're putting something into a bio bag or any kind of a biodegradable material, it won't decompose without air. And when it does get put into a landfill, it emits methane. And when it gets burned, it emits all kinds of things. They do capture the heat and the energy from burning our trash and make electricity out of it, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But by making compost, it's a good soil conditioner, not so much a fertilizer, but it's a good soil conditioner. And if you're growing plants or vegetables or flowers or anything, it's a great way to use that on your garden rather than relying on fossil fuel-based fertilizers. Compost is great for soil health, basically introduces a lot of microbes into the soil, and then the microbes do the job of taking the nutrients that are already in the soil from the rocks and minerals that are in the soil and mobilizing it, making it available to plants. So the way that happens is that compost, which is basically full of microbes, improves soil structure. It makes soil make these aggregates, which holds on to water, decreases water runoff, and allows water to percolate through soil. There's some research out there that shows that compost can reduce plant diseases and improve yields of plants, of vegetables. If you're growing tomatoes, you might get more tomatoes off a plant if you've added compost. And number 8 is pretty significant. I read an article that one time that said that if you add compost to an acre of farm, and by adding compost, what it helps soil to do is build organic matter. And for every 1% increase in organic matter, an acre of soil can hold an additional 27,000 gallons of water. That's a lot. And that organic matter actually is what is sequestering carbon in the soil. And my guess is that everyone in this audience is particularly concerned about climate change. I will say this, I don't know a ton about this, but I know that there's talk about, you've heard of carbon credits and SRECs for solar energy. So there's actually talk of carbon sequestration credits, basically paying farmers to sequester carbon in the soil. I don't know where that is, but it's an interesting idea. And as I said before, compost, really the benefit of compost is that it adds beneficial microbes to the soil, which do a great job of mobilizing nutrients so plants can absorb it. Okay, so this is a neat slide from an amazingly gross thing. Believe it or not, at CMAS, they actually do a waste audit every several years. And the most recent one was done in 2019. And they actually take a sample of all of the trash that comes to CMAS and dump it on the floor and then figure out what people are throwing away. So assuming that we in Hingham are representative of that, as you can see from that big blue wedge of the pie there, 21.5% of what was thrown in the trash is food waste. 8.7% of that is compostable paper. And then there's another pie slice that's not here because this is the top 10 materials, but the other item that's compostable is things like yard waste and leaves that somehow wind their way up in the trash. So we do a pretty good job of throwing our leaves and yard waste up at the top of the hill at the landfill. And that's great. So there's probably not a lot of contamination of that in our trash, but even still, that is 30% of the trash is what this is a mass DEP study that was done. And Hingham disposed of 5,444 tons of trash in 2019. If you do the math, that's actually, what did I add it up? It's 1,633 tons. And last time I checked with Randy Sylvester, head of our DPW, we were paying about $80 a ton to dispose of trash, to take it to Covanta CMAS. So that adds up to about $130,000 worth of material that we are paying to take to Covanta CMAS for them to burn it. And besides that, it's just a huge loss of a resource. You know, why take it away when you can do something with it locally? So I have, as Brenda said, you know, the town's recycling committee, the Cleaner, Greener Hingham committee, has been talking about this for a long time. And it comes up a lot on Facebook. People ask this question frequently: why can't we compost at the dump? And believe me, we've talked about it, and someday it may happen, but the people who run the transfer station are not keen on the idea of food waste at the transfer station. I think they're mostly concerned about vermin and problems like that bringing food waste would cause. So anyway, this is a very simplified diagram of what's going on underneath of the soil. So the plants take the energy from the sun, photosynthesize it, and make sugars. And there's this wonderful thing that's happening underneath of the soil. So the plants are taking the sugar and making it into the plant, the part we eat. So even, you know, even if you're eating a carrot, there's sugar in a carrot. Or if you're eating, that's a good example, a zucchini. You wouldn't think of a zucchini as having sugar in it, but it does. And plants have a handy way of keeping the bacteria that are in the soil happy by exuding sugars through the roots, okay? And the bacteria that are in the soil, and even more so in the soil if you've added compost, are fed by those sugars. And if you keep those bacteria happy, and if you don't till your soil on a big scale at a farm, or even on a small scale in a garden, there's a lot of microbial networks, especially fungal networks, that exist under the soil that, if they're happy, will build these aggregates. Humus is basically decomposed organic matter, and there's this chemical in the soil called glomalin. And basically, these are all long chain carbon-based molecules that, if left undisturbed, meaning untilled, will exist in the soil, and the carbon will build up in the soil. So that organic matter that I mentioned earlier, if you've ever sent a soil sample off to UMass to be tested, one of the things they'll tell you is what your percent organic matter. And the soil test, for example, at the community garden up at the top of Turkey Hill, Weir River Farms community garden, the soil sample result came back that the soil was about 6% organic matter. And by contrast, I went to visit a farm called Gaining Ground that's in Concord here in Massachusetts, and their soil sample showed 12% organic matter. So they're sequestering a lot of carbon in their soil, and they're able to hold onto a lot of water in their soil. So anyway, that's what the deal is with carbon sequestration, on a very simple explanation. So here's the how-to. This is a beautiful, simple graphic that comes from the Mass Department of Environmental Protection. And later on in my slides, I have a link to this website. There's a lot of information there about how to compost. And this is the recipe. So 3 parts by volume of brown stuff. And in the graphic there, you can see what's the brown. It's leaves, straw, shredded papers, cardboard, things like that. To 1 part by volume of green. That's your food waste. So Brenda talked a lot about meats and dairy and things like that. And unfortunately, I do not recommend composting any of that kind of stuff in a backyard composting system. There are commercial composters. If you were to have a contract with Black Earth Compost, or what's the other one? City Compost, or blanking on the second, Bootstrap Compost is the third company. They would allow you to compost things like meat and bones and fish and things like that. No dog or cat waste, but they would allow you to dump meat and dairy into your bin, but not for a backyard system. It doesn't get hot enough. It's very prone to being raided by critters that you don't want. You don't want rats. You don't want what have I had troubles with over the years? Possums, skunks, all kinds of critters will you put meat in your pile, it will cause all kinds of trouble. Anyway, so 3 to 1 by volume, greens to browns. Make sure it's moist, give it some water, because you're feeding a diverse microbial network of critters. Some you can see with your eyes, like worms and pill bugs and millipedes and centipedes, and a lot that you can't see, like the microbes that are living in the compost. And then give it a stir every once in a while. Add a shovelful of finished compost if you can, just to sort of inoculate the pile with some microbes. Stir it, and then wait 2 months, and boom, you're going to have some compost. Now, if you start this time of year, it's going to take longer than 2 months, because all of this process slows down in the colder weather. This is pretty much repetitive of what I just said, but just trying to drive home the point of what is green stuff, what's brown stuff. This I already kind of mentioned: no dairy, bones, foods that have sauces on them, you know, like salads that have been dressed, no dog or cat waste. Weeds that have gone to seed. If you're making compost piles that get hot, you can put weeds in, because the temperature will kill the weeds, but I actually don't have a lot of great luck in my backyard compost getting the compost hot enough. So I'm pretty picky about what I put in my compost. I don't put certain weeds in, like when I picked at the end of the season, my peonies very often have a fungal disease on them at the end of the season. And I also have a type of fungus on my tomato plants, so I don't compost them. I take them to the transfer station and put them up at the top of the hill. And there are certain weeds that spread with runners or any kind of invasive plant. I don't know if you guys know what garlic mustard is, but I would not recommend composting that. So when I say making layers, you don't really have to follow this strictly, but basically the idea is to sort of mix in browns. So you might put in a big 2-foot layer of leaves and then put some green stuff in, make sure it's nice and moist, add some soil, make sure it's moist, and then mix it around. So where to put your compost pile? So as I said before, a compost pile will heat up. A lot of people think that it heats up because the sun is warming it up, and that actually is not true. And in fact, you don't want a compost pile in the sun if possible. Shade is better because all those microbes that are living in the compost, if the compost pile dries out, the compost pile will stop decomposing. So put it in a convenient place, put it in a flat area if possible, and in the shade. And the reason why near a water source is if it does get too dry, it's good to be able to squirt a hose on it. It should feel like a wrung out sponge, not too wet, not too dry, just right. Okay, so these are some compost bins that are at a school, and the ones on the left there are new age composters. So years ago when I first moved to Hingham, the DPW in Hingham sold those, and actually I have a picture. My next slide is of my compost area in my backyard, and I have 3 of those. They hold a lot. That's 1,000 pounds is about a cubic yard in each. And that's one of the reasons why I like them. You can put a lot of leaves, grass clippings, food waste. And I'm a big fan of the 3 bay compost system. So you have one that's the add to bin, one that's the done and I'm using it as I'm planting my plants bin, and the other one is sort of sitting and decomposing and not quite ready. You can get away with less, but I find that's what works great for me. The one on the right is called an earth machine that holds a little bit less, but it has a much more rigid side, and some people like that. Maybe a little more critter proof. I've definitely had problems with mice and things like that crawling in my compost bins, but the mice can get into those machines as well. So nothing is truly critter proof. That's my backyard compost bin. So you can see the one on the left is duct taped. It's got a little bit of a split in it, but those compost bins are probably 26 years old. I moved here in 1993 and I bought them the first summer I lived here. So they've managed to hold up pretty well. Like I said, the one has a little bit of a crack in it, but you can see I've got, you can't tell what that is, but it's a garden fork in one and a shovel in the other. And I've got my sifter and my wheelbarrow at the ready. So I've got a lot of other pictures of other things that you might like better for the aesthetic of your yard. That left one is, I wouldn't call that beautiful, but that's certainly simple. It's made out of pallets and you can nail it together. I think this one, if you look carefully, it looks like it's either been attached with bungees or rope or zip ties. The one on the right actually was made with beautiful wood, and you can see there's the add, cook, and take pile, very nicely labeled. This was made by a guy who volunteered at the farm where I work, and that's his backyard pile. Very nice looking. And this is a system I found online, and actually one of the committee members on the Cleaner Greener Hingham committee built this for himself. And as you can see, I don't know if you can see in the picture, but the sides and the bottom are lined with chicken wire, which is not very resistant to, it'll rot eventually. So it's not perfect forever, but if you line the bottom of it, that's pretty critter proof. Maybe small mice could get in there, but if you live in an area where you're worried about rats, this is a good system and it's nice looking. So you can make a very simple pile like that one on the right there. That's just a built up pile with some things showing. And obviously that pumpkin there would be very delicious to a skunk. So I would not recommend leaving food visible. On the left there looks like what I would call a lasagna pile. You can see a layer of grass, maybe a layer of soil or compost, a layer of leaves. And a smart thing to do would be to take that and stir that around, but someone obviously set that up as an example. And that looks to me like just, not sure what you call that wire, but galvanized wire, comes in rolls. I bought it at Lowe's. I actually use that kind of wire to make compost screens, but that's a great way to store leaves. And I would suggest if you do want to start a compost pile this time of year, find a way to store leaves, put them in your yard in the corner under a tarp, or put them in a wire bin like that one on the left there. because you're going to need them next spring, next summer to mix in with your food waste. So these are compost tumblers. I think you have one of these, Anne, don't you?
I do, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, these work pretty well. Some people like them. And the thing that's nice about them is that you can sort of see it's on an axle and you can tumble it. So if you don't want to get into a compost bin with a garden fork or pitchfork, this makes turning very easy. I don't love the idea of these because they're not on the ground. And so the way a lot of microbes get into a compost pile is because the bottom of the bin touches the ground. And obviously this is not touching the ground. So you have to be really careful to monitor the moisture content of a bin like this. And you also have to make sure that you take a shovel full of soil from the ground that has bacteria and worms and things like that in it and put it into the bin, because that way it'll kind of inoculate the bin so that the decomposers can do their work. And this is a tumbler that I made out of a trash can, just put a bungee on the top. Wasn't in the mood to pay $150 for that fancy tumbler system. So basically you can make your own. Drill some holes in it to make sure there's air, and put some bungees across the top and you're good to go. So that link at the bottom there, the Mass DEP has a list that they put out every year about where you can get a low-cost bin. Hingham does not sell them, unfortunately, but there are a couple local towns here around listed that will sell you a bin. The first town listed says Cohasset sells the Earth Machine, which I showed you a picture of earlier, but you have to be a Cohasset resident. Although I happen to know that Peter went earlier this summer and bought one, and I guess he got lucky because they didn't ask him if he lived in town and they sold him a bin. So you might be able to buy a bin locally, or you can order them online. I know Lowe's sells a couple bins, different varieties of bins. So what's making all this magic happen? So hopefully, I've said this a few times, and you now know that it has nothing to do with the sun. It's really the microbes, bacteria and fungi that are doing the work. The worms get all the credit because kids love them. They think they're cute, but the worms are really eating the microbes, and they're not doing the decomposing. And the right amount of air and water, some mixing and turning, and after time, you're going to have a finished product. So this is a neat graphic also on the Mass DEP's website of the food web of the compost pile, the stuff that you can see with your naked eye. And on the bottom left there, all the stuff that you would need a microscope to see. So like I said, if you build a big enough pile and you have done your mixing properly, I don't know if you can see that dial on that compost thermometer, which is about a 2-foot long stem jabbed into that compost pile, and it's reading about 142 degrees, 144. That's good. Anything over 130 will kill weed seeds. It'll kill pathogens. So if you've put manure, animal manure, not cat or dog, but we use horse manure at the compost at the farm where I work, and anything over 131 will kill the bacteria in the animal manure, and it'll kill weed seeds. But I don't have a lot of luck doing this personally at home. I think if you add grass, because it's so high in nitrogen, it'll heat up. But after the microbes digest that, they're done giving off their heat, the pile will cool down. So everybody wants to know, okay, when am I going to get compost? And sadly, the answer is just, it depends. If your food scraps are chopped up into small enough pieces, if you're not throwing in big, thick stems of things, they'll break down more quickly. If the moisture's right, and if you've stirred it to make sure that you're putting air into the pile so that the aerobic bacteria can decompose things, you could have a finished product in as short as 8 weeks, not in the winter. And how do you know when it's done? Well, it'll smell good. You won't see the original ingredients. There's certain things that stick around longer than others, which is one of the reasons why we sift it. So we eat a lot of corn on the cob in the summer, and I'm still sifting out corn cobs from last summer. They take a lot longer to decompose. Also, we eat a lot of avocados. Avocado pits hang around for a long time. They will eventually decompose, as will even a peach pit. But it'll smell really good, and it will no longer be hot. And then it's ready. And then what do you do with it? You sift it. So that's just a homemade sifter made out of some 2x4s and that galvanized metal cloth. That's a 1/4 inch grid. Put it over top of a wheelbarrow, and sticks and undecomposed bits of food stay on the top, and the stuff that falls through the sifter is the stuff you can use. And like I said, you don't really have to be a gardener. You can put it on your grass, you can put it on your flowers, you can put it in a pot. And here's what you do with it. You can feed it to your plants. You can make a potting soil out of it. You can make compost tea, which Peter's going to talk about. You can put it on your lawn, or you can give it away. The compost at the high school, actually, we had so much at Hingham High School, a couple of years, that we actually sold it at the farmer's market. And it's very valuable. People who make compost know it and refer to it as black gold. So I've made every one of these mistakes. So trust me when I tell you that you don't want rats in your compost. That happened to us one year. That was not fun. If you don't stir it well, you can get a really bad smell, especially from grass clippings or too much food that hasn't been mixed with the dry ingredients like leaves and things like that. It gets really slimy, or you can have puddles of gross stuff, or you can have fruit flies, or as what happened to me many years ago, my compost pile was on the other side of the pile that the snowplow made at the end of my driveway, which is what propelled me to start composting in my garage. Actually, I should clarify that. Composting in my garage in worm bins, and that's what Peter's going to talk about. So now if you're a gardener, real quick, I'm almost done here. If you're a gardener, hopefully you have an appreciation of how important soil is. Most of the food we grow comes from soil. With the exception is fish. It's the only thing that we eat that doesn't come from soil. So we have to do a really good job of taking care of our soil, because it's all we have to grow the food to feed all of us who live on this planet. And as you can see on the right, in that right hand there, that is really spent, chalky, probably clay looking soil. And the soil on the left is much more rich and brown, much more likely to be high in organic matter. Adding compost is one way to make sure that your soil looks like the sample on the left. The top right is a picture of soil after some water runoff. I don't know if you can really tell that, but when soil has not been amended with compost, water just will run off and take all the nutrients downhill with it. That is a bad thing. And the bottom right there is a soil sample that's 1% organic matter. That's low, very low on the left, and 5% organic matter on the right. So that's my sales pitch for compost, whether you're a gardener or just an environmentalist or worried about the climate and the carbon in the atmosphere. Composting is a great way to do something. It's actually something we can do. I feel like there's not a lot we can do about other problems out there in the world, but composting is something we can do. So I will stop sharing my screen. And Peter, pass it along to you.
Thank you,
Hi,
Janet.
good evening.
Hi, Peter. Go ahead.
Dan, do you want to cover the questions or wait?
Well, I think what I'm going to do, Peter, given the time, is you go ahead, and there were a couple questions about sifting and what exactly to add, but let's save that for the end and let Peter get through his slides.
Okay. So this is, we call it black gold. And those children, I always believe, teach the children. They live in Honduras. We got worms from Tegucigalpa, and that represents probably 3 months of decomposition. This is my friend Elliott, who lives next to me. Elliott, would you like to introduce yourself? Turn off your mic and say hello.
Hi.
There he is. Okay, so this is really a nice system, because I just want to brag on Elliott a little bit. I call it the lazy man's, but it's really the smart man's composting, because what he does is he puts on the left, he puts leaves and some compost that hasn't been decomposed in a screened area. And the other part, he just composts, and he uses it on his grass, on his flowers and so forth. And it's really it's a great technique. The advantage that he has is that it's on the other side of the house. He lives on a corner lot, and so people don't see it. For me, it would be beautiful to see. I suppose some people would suggest that it was so beautiful, but it's a great technique. On the left, I do square foot gardening. And so one of the things that I'm learning to do is you can just take some land and you can take the garbage from your container inside and you can bury it. And what I do is I put a few red wiggler worms in with it. I cover it over, and in the springtime, it's all decomposed. And then we have great compost already in that 1 square foot. And so I believe, with this method, that your plants can grow like they're on steroids. On the right, I had a used trash container. I made a little compost around it so that Annabella could dig underneath and put it back up on the top. And that was going to be taken to the recycling area or thrown away as trash, but it's now a composter. Somebody asked in one of the meetings recently how you can do this composting in an apartment or on a deck. And so on the left is a double bucket composter. It's made with some mesh on top. There's mesh that covers the hole so that flies don't get in it. I put red wiggler worms in the bucket, and I've been using that this winter in my basement, and it is amazing. It's amazing how quickly the material decomposes and how effective it is. You probably want to have 2 if you were going to use it on a patio or on a deck. Over to the right is a tote composting system. And so I have 3 totes there. And you notice, maybe you can see the little tubes that are going into the totes. Well, what I do is I aerate the totes, because for me, turning the compost is a pain in the neck. I've got lots of compost bins around my house. And what this does is this accelerates. So oxygen allows the microbes to replicate. And the more replication you have, the more beneficial microorganisms you have. So it's an easy process. I don't have to stir anything around. I fill it up, it decomposes. When I figure it's ready, I stop putting stuff in it, I take it out, I sift it, and I use it. Very, very simple. Those 3 compost bins are now in my basement because I love my red wiggler worms. The red wiggler worms are down in the bottom of the slide. And in the wintertime, I would like to keep those red wiggler worms active. And so I use the same system. On the top, you see the aquarium pump. It's pumping oxygen or air into those bins, and decomposition and worm growth is happening all winter long. If any of you might want to notice, that's a beautiful view of Hingham Bay, but it also shows a compost container that's on my neighbor's counter. And, they're all different kinds. The Mendas, Steve and Maureen Demenda, they use this bin outside on the porch, so they continually fill it. I'll tell you a little story about what they do with that big container when it fills up. This is on the right here, is the ceramic pot that I used to use. It chipped and it kind of looked ugly. And so I went out and purchased, $3 cookie jar. And so we now use a cookie jar, which is on the left there. It really doesn't matter what you use, whatever is attractive or workable for you. In the slide on the right, you'll see a glass. The glass has red wine vinegar in it. There's some soap, Palmolive soap in the dispenser there. And people are always concerned about fruit flies. The answer to fruit flies is build a fruit fly trap. And so red wine vinegar, a little bit of liquid soap, and the fruit flies will take a dive and they'll get out of your kitchen really kind of quickly. This is an earth machine. Janice showed that before. Melissa Smith and her husband, they have volunteered to take a sifter. And so we have 6 sifters around Hingham that people can borrow. And Melissa admits that, you know, she could really improve her composting, but she's made a commitment that she's going to do it. I think a lot of people really feel as though our civic leaders can lead the way, and she is a leader for sure. When these are both compost tumblers that I have, the one on the left, it gets so heavy that I cannot tumble it. I just cannot turn it. The red wiggler worms really create a dense component of compost, and it gets too heavy. And so I've got an aerating pump there. The aerating pump pumps air into the composter. I don't have to turn it. I don't have to bother with it. I just put compost in it, and voila, it all kind of happens on its own. At the end of the season, I'll sift it out and hopefully put it on my beds in the fall and not on the spring, because it has all winter to kind of integrate into the soil. The one on the right, the black one, is one that I really like, but it's the same concept. They also use the aerators to aerate the soil. All of these bins have red wiggler worms in them, and they replicate like crazy. Each little egg that's produced by the worms has 4 or 5 little worms in it, and it's no problem getting them to reproduce. These are some pictures of school composting projects. Janice and Holly Farm have worked very hard on these projects. The ones on the left are earth machines. At Quincy High School, I had earth machines. Janice talks about her earth machines, her composter being 14 years old or so. I bought those earth machines at Quincy High School in 2001, and they're still using them. So they last a long time. They're very solid. Basically, put something in them, and you'll get compost. This is Hingham High School. Hingham High School has a green team. They really do a great job in terms of recycling or reusing the food or the compost that's in the cafeteria. They're really the flagship of Hingham in terms of just for the schools, in terms of teaching composting and the techniques of getting that beautiful soil or medium back into the ground. You can see the compost in the wheelbarrow on the right, which they use in the greenhouse and on their raised beds inside the atrium of the school. This is a random composting kind of technique. The one on the left, I grow potatoes in. So you see little slats. When the potatoes grow, I stick my hand in and pull the potatoes out. But I just put all kinds of leaves and things in it. I just bury them and I leave them there. On the right, I grow tomatoes in those buckets, and I fill it with organic material. I let that decompose in the spring. I just put my plants in there, and we've got a garden growing. This is my neighbor's idea. She has a beautiful dog, but as you know what dogs always do, they leave something, a present for you. And so she has purchased this dog composter. You lift the lid, you stick the dog compost or the poop into the composter. It decomposes, and you don't have to worry about plastic bags or throwing it in a place where maybe you don't want it, in a compost pile or whatever. One of the things that happens with people that use these ugly plastic bags that are all over the trails in our beautiful Hingham walkways is that when you bag it, it holds the moisture. And so if you put that into the waste stream, it not only weighs the poop, but it maintains the water. And so alternatives to putting in a plastic bag and just throwing it in the trash, I think is a great idea. These are compost containers. So I have about 400 gallons of rain barrels around my house. 2 of the rain barrels go into that red container is one of the compost bins. And so what I do is I aerate it. And I take the water from the black barrel, it goes into the red barrel, and I put compost tea in it, or worm castings. I also put humic acid and molasses in there. The molasses feeds the beneficial microorganisms. And then the only thing that I water my plants with, or basically the only thing that I water my plants with all summer, is compost tea. And the plants do great. On the right, that's a small compost tea blender. It is in my greenhouse, and I water my plants in the greenhouse. Now in the fall, when I'm trying to grow lettuce and keep herbs alive, and in the spring when I'm starting my tomatoes or peppers and squash and so forth. This is called Big Blue. It was given to me by a Hingham resident. It's a basically a raised bed, commercial raised bed. What I did was I decided that I wanted to reduce the amount of planting that I was going to do and increase the amount of composting that I would do. So I took the PVC pipe. I have holes in the bottom of that PVC pipe, and you can see this little solar panel here. What that's doing is that's providing energy for a battery that's inside this lamp. We provide these lamps to people in Honduras who do not have electricity. At the bottom, it has a little red pump. And what happens is when the sun comes out, it charges the battery and then the pump runs. And so I don't have to bring electricity to this compost bin. What I do is I do it through solar, and it seems to work great. Right here, you see the Domenas. They're emptying their compost into what I call Big Blue. And right now, this summer, what happened was they emptied their compost, on a regular basis. I didn't do anything to it. I never watered it. I never did anything to it. And the only thing that happened was that squash grew out of it. And I never touched anything. I never fertilized anything. I didn't ever water it. And so there are real benefits to composting. On the right, it's now being put to bed for winter. And so the leaves are on top. They will decompose, and they'll be able to mix in with the other food waste that we use. This is a fancy one. It looks nice. It's great. And I like it. But it's kind of expensive. It works. It's a 2-bin unit, and compost will be coming from that bin. Certainly, it's kind of nice looking on the side of my neighbor's house. And so these are my square foot gardens. Over here on the right, we've got a springtime. You can see in the bin almost in the middle, that's lettuce. On the right here, closest to us, those are herbs. Those wild plants that are growing along the sidewalk there, that's called arugula. And arugula is a weed. And so next time you go and have an arugula salad in an expensive restaurant, just remind yourself that you're eating weeds. On the left, we have a square foot garden. It's 3 by 3. The amount of tomatoes that come out of that, there are only 3 cells that are planted, could probably feed a family of 4. But it's amazing because in the square foot gardens, I use 5 different kinds of compost, peat moss, and vermiculite. There is no soil. And I have no pests. Absolutely no pesticides. Janice mentioned that you might want to use fertilizer. I do not use fertilizer. I just use compost, vermiculite. Vermiculite has some organic or some minerals in it that help with the process. But, for a person that doesn't want a big garden or wants to contain it to just maybe a few tomatoes in the summertime or maybe some lettuce or whatever, a 3 by 3 square foot garden, I call it the student garden, works really nicely. The kale that's in the back over here, that'll grow right through the winter and into the spring, and then it'll bolt to produce seeds. Last night, I think a deer came by and topped off one of my kale plants, but there's plenty of kale in the garden, so I don't have to worry so much. I'm involved with my wife with a project in Honduras, and the idea is to create a sustainable lifestyle for the people there. You probably realize that in Honduras, they've just had 2 hurricanes, which have devastated the entire population on top of the COVID virus. And so you can follow this process. I showed the kinds of things they do in Honduras. They basically do what I do at home. My wife and I, during non-pandemic periods of time, we travel to Honduras 3 times a year. And those students that I showed you in the first slide, they are carrying out some of the projects there. One particular person does a great job for us. These children live in at a nutrition center where they were malnourished and would have probably died if they went home to live with their families. But they're into the gardening as well, and it's really kind of nice. And so we have a time for questions and answers. And here's what Brenda asked me to put on the slide.
Thank you, Peter. That was so fun. I love touring your gardens and your composts. You can definitely tell you were a science teacher because just going to your house is like a science lesson. It's a lot of fun. So here you have all their individual email addresses up on the screen. Jot them down. They're just a wealth of information. I know they've certainly helped me out. But we do have some questions that people added in the chat. So I'm just going to run through them. I think maybe we've answered a few of them along the way. But we had a question about what to do with our yard waste. So leaves and sticks, weeds. You did mention, Janice and Peter, leaves, just throw them in your compost bin. That's how we kind of meet that brown criteria. So throw those in. What about sticks? I've wondered about that as well.
Well, if you have really thick sticks, I mean, they will decompose eventually, you can do a couple different things. You can put them in your compost if you want. You can chop them up into little pieces with clippers if you want to take the time to do that. Or you can just make a stick pile, and actually it makes a nice little habitat for chipmunks or birds to winter in. Or if you really want, you can make an oogle culture bed out of it. Does anyone know about oogle culture? I can't see faces, so if you're shaking your head, I can't see you, but oogle culture is just a German word for means growing on a hill. And I made an oogle culture garden at home, and it's a really neat idea. Basically, you just take a bunch of rotting logs and sticks and then pile some leaves and compost on top. And as they all decompose, it just creates this wonderful bed for growing. So you could do that with them, or you could take them to the transfer station, put them in a bag and back your car and take them up to the top of the hill.
So Janet, here's my observation. If you take a leaf or you take a stick, you can determine how quickly it's going to decompose by how long it took to grow that. Or that leaf.
True. Yep.
And so if you want quick compost, throwing sticks in there is you're kind of wasting your time. Okay. My neighbor, who I think is on this chat, his name is Leo Galvin, he prepares his garden now in the fall. He has beautiful flower gardens and a fish pond, and it just has a beautiful yard. He goes around the yard in the fall and clips his stems and sticks, and they go back into the soil, and they decompose quickly because all sides of that stick or material is all susceptible to decomposition. And so his technique is really great. I don't have all the enthusiasm or energy that he has, but he's got a great garden, and he just does it by clipping. It's just beautiful. It really, and it really reduces the amount of weeds in the garden as well. So that's a technique.
Peter, did you want to go and unshare your screen now that people have had a chance to?
I'm sorry.
That's okay. No, it's
Actually,
important
you know what?
information up there.
That reminds me, I realize I omitted my last slide, which actually has something I want to share with people.
Okay, Janice,
I-
pull that up, and we have quite a few
sorry.
questions, so I want to make sure we
Yeah.
get to them. Someone asked if we have to sift our compost, and my understanding is you definitely don't have to, but it's a nice way to kind of sift out those pieces that could maybe use a few more months to decompose. It's not necessary. I've seen people throw down, compost that's maybe 80 to 90% complete. I think sifting is more just weeding out those larger pieces. Is that correct? It's not necessary, but it's a nice thing to do.
Depends on what you're growing. I mean, like, if you're growing something that's a tiny little seed, like a carrot or lettuce or something like that, then sifting might be important because the seeds might be less likely to germinate if there's big chunks of things.
Right.
But if you're putting it on your grass or if you're putting it on your grass and you're going to walk barefoot, you don't want to step on an undecomposed peach pit.
Right, or a bunch of eggshells.
Right.
So yeah, we do have, like Peter mentioned, or forget if it was Janice or Peter, we do have 5 or 6 sifters that Peter made that we have free to loan out to people in town. I have one myself. So if you go on Sustainable Hingham or email Peter or Janice or myself, we can definitely lend out a sifter to borrow.
And let me just say one more thing about that. So Peter and I made a couple of house calls this spring and summer and fall. So, if you really want help, and I know I spent some time with Susan Randall, who's on the phone here, or Harbert, sorry. I'm happy to help people do this. And hopefully you can see this slide that's up here. There's a lot of resources on the internet. Peter and I are resources here in town, and I can send you all kinds of information. And it really pains me to have to put that last thing on there, that if you really, a lot of people are interested in pickup service because they feel that making compost in their backyard is too hard, and paying for a service is easy. And here are the 3 companies that as of right now pick up, and taking it to the transfer station for taking food waste to the transfer station is not an option right now, but maybe someday in the future. But I am not a huge fan of these because all of these companies are very far away. Black Earth Compost comes from Manchester. City Compost is called City Compost, but he's actually west of Worcester. And Bootstrap is also, I think they're based in, they go to a farm called Rocky Hill. They take their compost to a farm called Rocky Hill. Although they have a bunch of farms because they're also picking up compost in Providence. So they probably have a local place down there. But the point is, there's a lot of driving that happens which to me seems ironic. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there for completeness, but
well, it's funny because before I moved to Hingham, my city had door-to-door pickup of food waste for everybody. But then I finally decided it was time to get on board here. And the best piece of advice I got was just start it.
Right.
It can be as simple or as complicated as you want to make it. It can be as easy or as hard as it needs to be, but just start. You really can't go wrong. If you encounter some problems, we can help you make it some tweaks here and there, but just get started. That's what really pushed me over the edge and convinced me to do it. So we had a few more questions here. You had mentioned, Janice, especially for the tumbling composters, adding some soil to get the process started. And someone was asking what type of soil, but I know you told me just take your shovel, just right underneath the compost, just take any healthy soil and throw it in. The idea is just to introduce all those microbes.
So, even soil that's growing under grass, they say that a teaspoon of soil has 6 billion microbes in it, just a teaspoon.
Yeah.
So, you don't really need a lot, but basically just something to kind of add some microbial life to a compost, especially one of those rotary bins, the turning bins that are off the ground.
Right.
But any compost bin that's touching the ground, the reason why these piles decompose from the bottom up is because the decomposers are usually on the bottom and they work their way up.
Right.
So
I have one of each, so I'm comparing. Oh, Peter's got something.
Am I? Yeah, I'm not. And if you can do this discreetly, go to Wampatuck State Park, pick up some leaves, take a little trowel, take the soil that's rich and black and beautiful and stick it in a bag and bring it home and put it in your tumbler. And I'll bet the leaves next year will produce some more of that stuff. So there's lots of it over there. And that's what the humic acid that we use in our compost tea is made from microorganisms that are grown in New Mexico. It's got the finest microbes in the world. And so I bet Wampatuck State Park doesn't fall far behind. So discreetly take a bag, a little trowel, fill it, the bag, bring it home, and you're going to have some great microbes in your compost pile.
All right, so if I'm biking through Wampatuck and see you coming out of the woods with a bag, I won't ask any questions. John's asking, is there any problems with taking the pure compost and adding it to, let's say, a potted plant or your vegetable garden, or should you dilute it with like a peat moss or other type of soil?
Oh, well, if you're yeah, I mean, actually I had a recipe in my presentation with, well, actually that's what Mel's mix is. Actually, maybe you want to talk about that, Peter. I mean, you wouldn't want to plant a potted plant in 100% compost. You need some inorganic mineral material, which comes from, soil is just the broken down bits of rocks that are from the lower, deeper down layer. It's a mix of minerals plus humus, which is the decomposed living stuff. So you can add humus to a house plant. In fact, I have I think it's a hibiscus. It's a flowering hibiscus. I put it outside in the summer and I give it a handful of compost, I don't know, every 3-4 months. So instead of giving it some kind of a fertilizer, I just give it some compost. I also have a Meyer lemon tree that is in my house in the winter, and I give that a handful of compost every once in a while. So yes, you can give compost to a potted plant.
Yeah, the problem with pure compost is it's dense. And one of the things that has to happen with plants is the roots have to get through that dense material. And so Janice mentioned Mel's mix. Mel Bartholomew made this concept of square foot gardening, and he just passed away this past year. He uses 5 different kinds of compost. He uses vermiculite, which is organic ash or volcanic ash, and he also uses peat moss. Peat moss is gonna go away soon because we're mining it all. But one of the good things is that once it goes away, we're going to start using coconut coir, and we're going to be able to get the coconut coir from Vietnam and Central America and boost their economy. So that's a good thing.
Okay, and Peter, this one's for you. Worm bins. Someone was mentioning that they've heard pros and cons of having drainage holes. What would you recommend?
Yes, that's true. The worms really secrete urine, and it becomes a problem. And I've tried running tubes into 2-liter bottles, and I just let it go on the ground. I just in my basement, I run a tube into a bottle, but outside it's on some of them are on crushed stone or whatever. I just let it go away. I could harvest it if I wanted to, but I don't. And so yes, you can harvest it. You can use it as part of your compost tea. You can use it just to water your plants with. It's really a good nutrient. I happen not to bother. Yes, that's true.
This is something that happens to me a lot as well. There's a question from John. Do you have any tips from preventing mold in your countertop kitchen compost bucket?
Well, you know what? I don't think that's a huge problem because mold is a decomposer. It's a fungi.
I remember texting you, Janice. I'm like, oh, my lemons are moldy. Is that okay? Can I throw that in? You're like, yes, of course.
I mean, no, I don't think it's a problem. I mean, unless you have a mold allergy and you don't want it in your home, then I guess what I would say is take it outside and dump it and then wash the inside of the container really well.
But any tips for preventing it? I guess it's just there's so much moisture in there, right?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
I don't know. Mine doesn't get moldy. Ours fills up probably. I have a similar one to the picture Peter showed. And I don't know, every 2-3 days, depends on how much cooking I'm doing, but you know.
Yeah, with the worms, when you feed the worms the food waste, they don't really like lemons or citrus kinds of material. So we do something other than put them in worm bins. And I'm not going to tell you what that is. I don't throw them in the trash.
I have a question myself, maybe for Brenda or Janice. We've talked, Janice, I know you've mentioned this before, a difference between composting your food scraps and the garbage disposal. Can you talk a little bit about, like, is it bad to put food in the garbage disposal as opposed to composting it? Because I think a lot of people think of that as a efficient way to get rid of food.
Yeah, I mean, I have a story about that actually. So earlier I mentioned the anaerobic digester in Boston, you know, the MWRA in Boston, Deer Island, you know. For a while, they actually were recommending that people put their food waste down the garbage disposal in Boston because all wastewater, meaning sink water, toilet water, shower water, goes to the MWRA, and they actually were not at full capacity. So that's great. You know, they, for a while, actually, they were trucking food waste to the MWRA because they were going to process it there. But have you ever driven to Deer Island? You know, it's through a very sort of meandering neighborhood in East Boston, and then I forget the name of the town that it goes through. But anyway, they did not want those trucks driving through their town, and they put a quick stop to that. I think it went on for I don't know how many months or a year or whatever. But anyway, that's not the case here in our area. I mean, if you were to put food in your down your garbage disposal, I think it goes to Nut Island. Isn't that what happens to our sewage? Does anyone? That's our local.
There's no longer Nut Island.
It's not Nut Island.
No, it goes all the way over to Deer Island.
I don't think so. I think ours goes to Nut Island.
No,
We're not part of the MWRA.
Pardon me?
I don't think we're part of the MWRA for sewage.
There are 43 towns. There are 40. Well, we don't need to discuss it. But there are 43 towns.
It's okay. I think the bottom line is maybe just let's go.
Metropolitan Boston. It all goes to the MW. It used to go to Nut Island. Nut Island is dysfunctional now.
Okay.
The more questions you ask, the more you find out, and the more questions you have. But I think that's it for tonight. That's all the questions. Again, we have all their email addresses if you want to find out more. The managing food waste stuff, I think I know when I first started really making the decision to become aware of it, it's really quite glaring how much food we waste if we're not really paying attention. So thank you, Brenda, for those super helpful tips and for the wealth of information on how to compost our food scraps. So just as we're wrapping up this call, all the slides will be put on the Hingham Net Zero website, and this forum will also be put on the website. That's hinghamnetzero.org. If you don't already follow us on Facebook, please do. That's where you get all the up-to-date information, and that's where we give you opportunities to take action to help us advocate for climate action. If you're not aware, I'm just going to quickly mention the Climate Change Task Force in town right now. They're currently drafting a warrant article to get a climate action plan on the April 2021 town meeting agenda. So Hingham Net Zero is very much focused on supporting this process. We're doing a number of things to help move this along and ensure that we get a yes vote in April to create a climate action plan for the town of Hingham. We are going to have bi-weekly standouts that you can sign up for. So follow us on Facebook for that. We're going to have postcard writing campaigns. We're going to have more awareness building steps. So I invite you to join us. If you're not on our distribution list, please send an email to hinghamnetzero@gmail.com. There's lots of opportunities to help us out and take action. And I kind of feel like this is the moment our town has been waiting for. We have a few months now to really put in a good effort to get this climate action plan passed. And we appreciate all the help we can get. I'm going to quickly check the chat here. No more questions. So I want to thank you so much, all of you, for joining. And please continue to follow us along. We're so appreciative for everyone that shows up for our Hingham Net Zero events. So thank you so much. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you, Turner, for hosting us on Zoom as always. And we'll stay in touch. Have a good night.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.